Okay, well, we're here in Philippians 1. Now, Steve, just so you know, I am holding you personally accountable for anything Cal does. So it is your job to keep him under control. We're in Philippians chapter 1, and as we've been going through and looking at the text, we've covered that first half of the chapter, which is Paul's introductory remarks, where he really simply says how much the Philippians mean to him. And that sets the tone for the whole book. So as we go through the book, you just want to remember Paul's attitude towards the Philippians, where they, as he said, you are my joy, you are my crown. He remembers them always with thanksgiving in his prayers. It is a true joy to him to think of this congregation. They are faithful, they are steadfast, they do what is right, they have bared up under afflictions. And they had written to Paul to find out how he was doing. So here's Paul, he's in his Roman imprisonment, and the Philippians, in their great love for Paul, so you see it's a mutual relationship, they sent to find out how Paul was doing, which is no small thing. Because we think, well, if I want to find out how somebody is doing, you send them an email, you make a phone call. Not so with them. If you want to find out how Paul was doing, you had to send somebody to Rome to do it. So it was no small task to find out how Paul was doing. It would be like if you and I want to find out how somebody in Florida was doing, and you had to travel there to find out. How important would it have to be for us to do that? It would be a meaningful thing, even with airplanes and whatnot, to actually physically travel there. And so Paul, in this second half of the letter, is outlining for them what life has been like and what is going on. And his whole attitude in it is joy. It's been good, folks. It's turned out well. Things have been positive. And you see that tone throughout the book of Philippians is, here's a man writing of how wonderful life is, how wonderful his future is and what it holds, and he writes it from prison. And so it just really should overwhelm us with the hope and the joy that we can have as Christians. And so Paul wrote, and let's see here. Let's start you start down about verse 12. This is a little bit of backtracking here. But he points out that as he had been there for 2 years in this kind of house arrest sort of situation, he'd been teaching and preaching Christ with all boldness. That's what Acts 28 tells us. And Paul reiterates that in Philippians 1, because down in verse 13 he says, in my imprisonment, it's turned out for good because all of the palace guard, all of the Praetorian guard has found out about me, and they've heard the gospel because of me. And so Paul, here he says, well, I'm in prison, but let me tell you something good about that. I've had a chance to preach to people I would have never had a chance to preach to otherwise. I've had a chance to talk to prison guards, to Roman soldiers, to soldiers who are closely tied to Caesar's household. That's amazing. I would have never had a chance to talk to guys like that before. He's a silver lining sort of preacher is really what he is. And so Paul says that this circumstance in my life has brought me near to people I would have never had an opportunity to otherwise. Well, that's an important lesson for us. As we look at our lives, your life is going to take turns that you don't expect and aren't necessarily ones that you're going to like every time. And it may very well happen that you go through a difficult time just so you can be at the same spot as somebody else who needed to hear the message that you have to share. And so we can certainly see an example of that in Esther. You have Esther and all the things she went through in life. What was the point of it? Well, Mordecai sure thought he knew. Mordecai said, I think you're here to be queen at just this moment for just this task of going in and saving the people. And so Paul says, that's what I found. Here it is, I've been imprisoned, and nobody would say, hey, let's go to prison. I'd really like to be in prison. But it's given me a chance to talk to people I wouldn't have otherwise. And same would be the case for us today. If tomorrow you got thrown in jail, you wouldn't like it. But would you get a chance to talk to people if you went to jail that you wouldn't normally get a chance to talk to? Yeah, you definitely would. And that's what Paul found. He said another byproduct was that evangelism was increasing in the church in Rome, that this congregation here in Rome that had already existed before Paul was there, Paul had now come, and they saw what Paul went through, and they saw that he stood by the truth, and they said, boy, if Paul can preach in chains, we can do it without the chains. If Paul can do it with the difficulties he's got, we can do it without. And so he says, now in verse 14, the most of the brethren, trusting in the Lord because of my imprisonment, have far more courage to speak the word of God without fear. Paul had become a rallying cry to the saints in Rome. We can do this. We can preach Christ. We can be bolder. We need to be courageous. And Paul went on to say, well, not only have the brethren who love me done this, but actually my enemies have done this. Now, this was a problem Paul faced his whole life as a preacher, is that Paul would go in, he'd set up congregations, and there were inevitably people within those congregations that became jealous of Paul. Because Paul was quite a figure indeed. Paul was the kind of guy that changed lives. He could come into a city, start a congregation up, and leave, and that congregation would successfully exist for years without him. He really had an amazing ability. Well, Paul's fame spread throughout the brotherhood of his zeal, his fervor, his apostleship, and where he'd come from, how he'd persecuted the church, and now he'd changed and with great boldness was speaking out in the name of Christ. And there were people in the church who got sick and tired of hearing about Paul. And they got tired of the praise that Paul got. And they started to kind of do just like Aaron and Miriam did with Moses. Remember, Aaron and Miriam were Moses' siblings, and there came a point where they're out there in the wilderness, and Miriam and Aaron said, what makes Moses so special? And they decided to argue the point, and they were punished for it. Well, the same thing happened with Paul. There are people in the church that were jealous of him, and Paul says, even my enemies in the church are evangelizing more, because they figured out in their mind, their kind of twisted, immature mind, that if we preach about Christ more and we convert more people, that's going to make Caesar mad at the church, and Caesar's going to want to do something about this religious movement that's turning the world upside down. And you know what? Caesar's going to let Paul have it. He's going to really lay into Paul because of what we're doing. So what we really need to do is preach Christ as loudly and as boldly as possible, because it'll make Caesar mad, and then Paul will get in trouble. And you know how Paul saw that? Instead of Paul getting caught up in the bickering and the fighting and the arguing, Paul said, all I really hear is my friends are preaching Christ, and my enemies are preaching Christ, and Christ is being preached, so I guess things are turning out okay. And so Paul once again sees that silver lining. He says the gospel is being preached. And you can see that in Philippians 1:18. Paul says, what then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed. And therein I rejoice, yea, and will rejoice. So here Paul, he looks at it. His friends are preaching. His enemies are preaching. The gospel is being spread. Even the prison guards are hearing about it. And Paul says, that's what I want. I spent my whole life wanting to preach Christ, and you know what? Here I am in prison, and it's happening. So I rejoice in that. There's a silver lining to this that is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And so as we look at Paul, what is this man's attitude in life? No matter what situation, God is good. What an awesome, awesome message. Here's a guy, he really did see it all. He saw all the pain and suffering life could bring. And he said, God will see me through it. God will bless me. It'll turn out okay. I rejoice, yea, and will rejoice. And so you get this tone from Paul of just true joy at the life of a Christian and the providence of God. In verses 19 through 20, he says, I know that this shall turn out to my salvation. When he says, I know that this shall turn out to my salvation, he's not talking about the salvation of his soul. Paul already knew where that was. He's going to, not far from now, say, if I die, what's going to happen? I'll gain. I'll be blessed. So he's not talking about salvation of his soul. That word salvation, some translations translate it deliverance. Paul's saying, as I look at all these things going on, all of the ups and downs that I've been going through, and I look at how God is working and weaving it all together into this beautiful tapestry, I know that it will turn out for my deliverance. That is my deliverance from prison, which is the case. Paul will eventually be released from prison this time. He says, this shall turn out to my salvation from prison through your supplication and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ. Because I know you're praying for me, and I know that God will take care of me. According to my earnest expectation and hope, that in nothing shall I be put to shame, but that with all boldness, as always, so now also Christ shall be magnified in my body, whether by life or by death. Now I have bolded there my earnest expectation, because that is just a really cool phrase. In the Greek language, that word it's the type of word that means to strain the neck. It's kind of like when you roll down the car window and you have a dog sitting in the car. What does the dog do? He strains the neck. He gets his head out there. He wants to sniff the air. What's out there? That's what that earnest expectation means. Paul, as he sat there in prison, saw all these things going around, saw all these things happening. He had friends. He had enemies. He's waiting on Caesar. The church is in great affliction in the Roman kingdom. He says, it'll be okay. And I earnestly expect God to deliver me from this. I've been praying, I know you've been praying, and I strain the neck. I stretch my head out. When's it going to happen? How's it going to be? See, Paul didn't know how he was going to be delivered. Paul didn't know how it was going to work out, but he knew it would. And that, folks, is the attitude we need to have as we pray. As we approach God with our concerns, we're told to pray in faith without doubting. So if you pray for something, you are to have an attitude of God will take care of it. Now, do you know how God will take care of it? No, you have no idea whatsoever. You're going to pray and you say, well, God, take care of me in this problem over here, or take care of my brother who's suffering through this, or take care of the church that is dealing with this turmoil here. And you're going to look at it and you're going to have no idea whatsoever how it's going to work out. But I want you to do something. I want you to strain the neck. I want you to look. I want you to pray and then begin to look for how God will solve the problem. How will God make it work out? Because you know He will. Even when things don't work out the way we expect it, what do you always find? That even when it doesn't work out the way you expected, it still works out. God takes care of it. And that was Paul's attitude. He said, I see all these things going around and all these things that are happening that I didn't expect to happen. I didn't think that me being in prison would make it so that the whole Praetorian Guard would know the things they did. I didn't think about the fact it would give the church boldness. I didn't think about the fact that it would make even my enemies start to preach Christ. But it has. And I earnestly expect, I don't know how it'll work out, but I know it will. God will cause this to work together for good. And so, in life, that's the attitude we ought to have. That is the attitude of a joyous Christian. It's the attitude of a faithful person. As you look at Paul in one of his darkest times, and Paul didn't see it as a dark time. Paul said, there's something out there on the horizon. I don't know how it'll look, but it'll turn out. And so this is a man that truly knew how to place his trust in God. And he says, it's my earnest expectation and hope, and he says that in nothing shall I be put to shame. Well, that's the other part to it. Paul, here, what could Paul do to take care of his imprisonment? Nothing. And that was totally out of his hands. Whether he lived, whether he died, whether he was free, whether he was in prison, those things he could not have any say-so in whatsoever. Paul only had control over one thing, and that was himself. And Paul says, I wait on God with earnest expectation, and as far as my behavior, I'm going to make sure that in nothing will I be put to shame. I'm going to make sure that for that small portion of things on this planet I do have control over, I'm going to do it right. I'm going to be faithful. I'm not going to do anything to shame the name of God. I'm not going to do anything that I will regret later in life. I'm going to make sure that with all boldness, as always, so now also Christ shall be magnified in my body, whether by life or by death. Now, that's a big statement. There is Paul saying, if they kill me, I have only one thing I got to worry about if they kill me, that I die an honorable death. And if I live, I've only got one thing I need to worry about, that I live an honorable life. That's all I got to take care of, that I just don't shame the name of my Lord, that I don't do anything that would bring any sort of bad reputation to Him, that I would magnify Him in my body, whether I do it in life or whether I do it in death. You could just take that one verse right there, and if you live by that, you're going to be okay. If every one of us simply said, whether I live or whether I die, I'm going to make sure I magnify the Lord in my body. Well, that's the sum of it, isn't it? That's the whole job and task on this earth. We tend to get caught up in, well, what if this happens? Or what if that happens? Or what if this other thing? What if so-and-so does this? Or what if this happens to the country? And we have all these things that we get concerned about. And Christ Himself said, you get anxious sometimes when you ought not to. Don't worry about tomorrow. Every day has enough troubles of its own. Just make sure, whether in life or death, you magnify the Lord. Anybody have any comments or questions? Okay, so here's Paul. How are things going for Paul? If you just hear Paul's side of the story, everything's great. Boy, it's just wonderful. You would think that Paul was over here on vacation. Things are great. Things are wonderful. Things are turning out well. But Paul had it very rough as he awaited trial. Now, starting in verse 21, Paul begins to say some things that are so profound that I can guarantee you will not walk out of this class totally comprehending them. And I know that because I have spent all week looking at them, and I know I do not totally comprehend them. These are the things that a hopeful, joyous life is built on. And if we could grasp these the way Paul grasped them, the rest would just be a piece of cake. It really would. These are Paul's message of hope. Paul says, for to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. You just take that one sentence. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Do you realize how much is in there? Paul believed there was no bad outcome for him. There was no bad outcome. The worst that they could do to him would be that he died. He says, that's it. The worst thing that could happen is my life here would end and I would die. Well, if that's the case, what does Paul say? To die, it's gain. I'll be okay. I'll go to meet my Maker. I'll go to be with Jesus. And he says, if I live... Now, Paul knew as a faithful man, he was going to magnify Christ in his body, whether life or death. He says, if I live, it is a chance to do Christ's work. And that's an awesome thing. Remember what Christ said on the subject of work on this planet? He says, store up for yourself treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys. That's what Paul says. He says, if I get to live another day, for every day I'm on this planet and I'm living and I'm breathing, it is another opportunity for me to do Christ's work and store up treasures for myself in heaven. So if I live, I get to continue to bring progress to the work the Lord has for me here. I can do good. I can change lives. I can be a part of the most important message mankind has ever heard. And I can store up treasures for myself in heaven. And if I die, then I get to go and reap the rewards of those treasures I've been storing up in heaven. That's it. That's the whole message of life there. For a Christian, when we When we really begin to grasp this idea, it changes everything. Because it is no longer a matter of, will it work out or will it not work out? You have your answer. What was Paul's answer? Will it work out or will it not work out? Paul said, it'll work out no matter what the result is. Whether they kill me or not, it'll work out. It'll be just fine. I will be a blessed man. So it is no longer about how my life turns out. My life will be okay. Because I'll either stay here, and if I go through affliction here, Paul says it's just a light affliction. It won't last forever. I'll be okay. Now it's going to hurt. And remember, Paul talks about this in joy, but do you think he enjoyed being in prison? Or being beaten, and shipwrecked, stoned, all those things he went through? No, he didn't enjoy them in the moment. But Paul said, they are really but light afflictions. If I live, I'll go through light afflictions and I'll store up treasures in heaven. And if I die, I'll go to be with my Maker. The result is always positive when you're a Christian. It is always good. And so Paul had a different outlook on life than anybody else. He looked at life from the standpoint of it being a win-win. There was no bad outcome for him. And so he could purely dedicate him to whatever was in front of him right then and there without having to worry about tomorrow or the day after or the day after that, because he knew to live as Christ and to die as gain. And then he says, if I live in the flesh, this is the fruit of my labor. In other words, he says, if I'm in the flesh, what I'm doing is I'm bearing fruit. My work will make a difference. I can make an impact. And that's an exciting thing. As a Christian, you can know that if you are here in the flesh and you are living the way the Lord intended, your life is making a difference. It's bearing fruit. It is doing good. Your life isn't just marking time. And that's a hard thing for us to comprehend sometimes, because remember how David thought of his life? When David stepped back and thought about his own life, he said, I'm just a nothing. I'm just a worm. You fly in an airplane and you look down and people are just like itty-bitty little dots down there. The cars are itty-bitty dots. And so you can say, well, what does my life matter? Well, Paul said, I realize that if I'm here, I can do some things that matter. And I may not realize how much they matter. I may not realize the kind of good that I'm doing, the kind word that I showed somebody at just that right moment, or the person I invited to services who turned me down, but then when two other people later invite them, they come. You may never know what good you can do, kind of like that rock being thrown in the pond. The ripple effects go out, and you don't always get to see where they have changed things. But you can know one thing. If you are on this planet and living as a Christian, you are going to make a difference. You're going to bear some fruit. Your life matters. It has a value. And so Paul says, to live is Christ, to die is gain. If I live in the flesh, this is the fruit of my labor. I can make a difference. And then he says, and what I shall choose, I do not know. That word, I don't know, I do not know, it's the idea of I can't recognize it. I can't perceive it. Paul's going to say, I'm betwixt between the two. If you had asked Paul, which would you rather do? Would you rather die or would you rather live? Paul's answer would be, I don't know. I don't know what I'd rather do. Now that is a man with hope. Because I think of my life and the kind of person I am, and I believe in heaven. I have no doubt that it exists. I know that it's real. I know that God will take care of me. I know, as Paul says, it's a place of gain. It will be far better. But then if you said, Scott, do you want to live today or do you want to die and go to heaven? Now, I got an answer for you. I'm not like Paul. I could perceive what I want. I want to stay. I've got kids that I want to see grow up. And I have a wife that I want to live many good years with and enjoy. I want to see how things turn out with these brethren I love here in this congregation. I want to be a part. I've got stuff to do. I've got a life to live. It's real easy for me to answer that. You say, well, Scott, which would you rather choose? I want to stay. That's what I want. But Paul was a man who you asked him that question. He goes, that's a good question. I'm not sure. If I'm here, I can do some good, but I really think I'd rather be home. That's a guy with a good grasp on how great heaven is, isn't it? Yeah.
Do you have any idea how old he is when he's saying this?
His actual physical age, well, not necessarily, because we don't really know the age of Paul when he started, but you would be, at this point, he's been, let's say we rough it. Okay, I'll just give you a very rough estimate here. Let's say Paul comes on the scene at the age of a man in Jewish attitude, which was age 30. He may very well have been older than that. But, you say Paul's 30, and then he comes on the scene, and he goes out and he's preaching. Well, we really, at this point, you would be looking at him being probably 60, late 50s minimum. So he's not a super young guy, but on the other hand, you got some life left in you, I'd like to think. Then I know some of you in your late 50s, you ready to die? You still got some kick left in you? So now that's a very rough estimate, an emphasis on the very. But if you're trying to get a feel for it, he wasn't 40. He would have been well past that kind of range. I don't know if that helps at all. And so Paul says, I don't know. I've seen what this life is like, and I'd rather go home. And so Paul says, I am hard-pressed from both directions, having the desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is very much better. And if you look at that in the Greek, it's like saying very, very, very better. It's not just, well, that's a lot better. It's very far much better, wow, kind of thing. It's a huge emphasis. He says, I know if I depart and am with Christ, it is way beyond anything here. And so Paul says, I'm hard-pressed because as long as I'm here, I can do some good. And I like doing good. And I like making a difference. But if I go and be with Christ, that's so much better. Now, it's important to remember, Paul had seen where he was going to go. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul talks about the fact, and he says it kind of in a sideways way. He says, I know a man who'd seen paradise. I know a man, whether in the body or not, who'd gone up to the third heaven. But he's referring to himself. He's talking about himself, and he's saying, I have been there. When Paul had first started preaching, he was converted, baptized there in Damascus, and then he left Damascus and went off into Arabia for about 3 years. And we know nothing about what happened there in Arabia. Just absolutely nothing whatsoever. Other than the fact that had to be the time that Paul had this vision of paradise. And so Paul's whole preaching life, he had in his mind an image of paradise. Paul said, when I went there, I heard things it is not lawful for a man to utter. I heard things I cannot legally tell you. I saw things that are just beyond human comprehension. So here's Paul, and Paul is saying, I'm hard-pressed. On one hand, if I stay here, I can do some good work and bear some fruit. But on the other hand, I want to be with Christ because that is very far better. And when he says it's very far better, he says it as a man who had seen it. He had seen paradise. He knew what was waiting for him. Now, folks, that should give us some huge encouragement. Paul was a guy who saw what was on the other side, and he knew it really was better. Have you ever had a vacation you were planning and looking forward to, and you got excited for it, and you thought about all the things you were going to do, and then you got on the vacation, and it just wasn't as good as what you expected? You were looking forward to this perfect vacation in Hawaii, and then it rained the whole time. You went on this trip and you thought, oh, it'll be 2 weeks of wonderful relaxation, and you get the stomach flu the first day you're there. And it just didn't turn out the way you expected it to. Paul says, I know when I get to heaven, when I get there to paradise, when I get to that third heaven where God is, where Christ is, I know it'll be better. He had no doubt. His hope was solid. It was firm. It was fully grasped by him that this life gave him a chance to do much good, but he was going to go home to a place so much better. It wasn't even, you couldn't even talk about it. It was just so beyond our comprehension. Folks, we have hope. And Paul wants us to know about that hope. He wanted the Philippians to know about that hope because remember a Philippian letter, what's it about? Joy. And Paul said, you want to really know where my joy comes from? I think about where I'm going. I think about where I'm storing up treasures. And I think that someday I will close my eyes here, and I will be with Christ. I want you to imagine there will come a day where every one of us will breathe our last breath. And then as Christ said, the faithful are escorted by angels. The angels will take you up to be in paradise. And the faithful will be there. And you will be with Jesus. Can you imagine that great day? You get to see Him with your own eyes. You get to see Him as He is. This God who walked among us and has given us this, and you see the kind of man He was, and you look at it and you think, I'm going to get to meet Him someday and bow my knee and say, oh, Master, I'm so happy to be here. That's what gave Paul joy. That was the life. That was what it was all about. So Paul said, I'm hard-pressed. I don't know which one I'll choose. But I know whenever that day comes to die, it'll be a day of gain. It'll be a good day. It'll be best day of my whole life, the beginning of the most important time in your whole existence. Any questions on that? And then Paul says in the very next verse something that inspires me to be a better person. Because as Paul speaks and he knows so clearly how great heaven will be, he says, convinced of this, yet to remain on the flesh is more necessary for your sake. And convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith. Paul came to the conclusion that he thought, I will be delivered. He kind of saw the writing on the wall. He says, I don't know for sure, but I think I will be delivered. And he says, the reason for it is because for me to remain on is more necessary for your sake. I still have work to do here. That was Paul's attitude. Paul believed with all his heart that as long as he had a breath in his body, what was he here to do? God's work. He was going to do it, the best of his ability. And as long as he was still breathing, that meant there was still work to do. There was still something to get done. There were still tasks at hand. There was labor that he had to be working on. Folks, that's the kind of people we should be. There was no, let me just ride it out with Paul. And if anybody could have done it, it would have been him. With all that he had done and all that he had worked, if anybody could have said, well, here I'm in prison, I might as well just let the clock tick out, folks. It would have been Paul, but he didn't. As long as there was breath in his body, he was going to use it for the glory of the Lord, so that Christ would be magnified in his body, whether in life or in death. So as long as you and I are here, what's the message Paul gives us? There's something you need to do. There's work for you. There's something meaningful for you to get about. And he says, where's my focus while I'm here? Is it on myself? He says, if I remain on the flesh, it's more necessary for your sake. That was Paul's attitude. As long as I'm here, who's it about? Is it about me? It's about Christ's people. It's about doing the Lord's work. It's about others. It's about putting my hand to the plow. And Paul firmly believed his reward was not on this planet. It's not about here. It's not about, I'll get my luxuries, I'll get my pleasures here. As long as I'm here, I've got work to do for others' sake, for the labor of the Lord. And my reward is where? When I get to paradise. When I get to go and be with my master and he tells me, well done, good and faithful servant. That's when it will be very far better for me. So, here's a man of joy, and he writes, and he says, let me talk to you about death. And it's a very different attitude towards life and death than you see most of the time. This was a man who knew who he believed in and knew what life was really about. Like I said, I read this and it inspires me. It makes me realize how much I need to grow, how far I've got to go before I can really say that I'm the kind of person, the kind of man that the Lord wants me to be. Anybody have any questions? Okay, so as we continue down here, we'll. Oh, yes. Hi. Sorry.
This is back up in chapter 18, or verse 18.
Uh-huh.
Back a ways, but
Yep.
had to step out for a minute.
No problem.
About this. Should this be our attitude towards people that preach, like, for example, like Joyce Meyer or something? Should we have this attitude that it is Christ being preached?
That's a very good question. As you look at it, I think yes, in part. Now, you see the televangelists and things like that, and do they sometimes preach the truth? Yeah, sometimes they do. Do they always? No. And so I think it's one of those things where as you look at it, that's what Paul was saying, that we always stand by the truth. And if the truth is being taught, I'm happy about it, wherever it comes from. However, at the same time, Paul will write in other letters about these same people. Here he says, the silver lining is they're out evangelizing because they hate my guts, but they're out evangelizing, and I'm happy with that. But in other letters, he'll talk about these same people, and he'll say, now when they teach false teachings, and he'll call them dogs. That'll be the language he used. He'll call them, they're like dogs. And we're not talking about like Chewy type dogs. We're talking about the mean, nasty, mongrel, rabid dogs, that you wouldn't want around. And so it almost seems hypocritical, but what he's saying is, if the truth is preached, whether in pretense or truth, they're preaching it for the wrong reasons, I'll take it. But as soon as they move away from the truth, I'll hammer them, and I'll stand by the truth. So it's a balance between, well, I guess you'd put it kind of the same way as here in America. Would you rather live in America that is still considered a Judeo-Christian society, or would you rather move to a Muslim nation? I'd much rather be here, because there are Christian values here. And I'm happy with that, and I'm thankful that we live in a nation that has some of those principles still in it. But then you say, well, Scott, what do you think about all the immorality in America? It drives me crazy, and I'll hammer on. So it's kind of the same idea as that, where you're happy in one sense, but in another you're not. Have I just made it totally mud, or is that useful at all? That's useful? Okay. So I think it's kind of that attitude where, as you look at it, whenever the truth was preached, whenever the word of Christ got out and it got people thinking about spiritual things, that was a positive. And then hopefully you can take that beginning and begin to wrap it into the truth so that people can actually hear the full message of Christ. Any other comments or questions? Any other hands I missed? Okay. So let's finish off the chapter here real quick. He says, down in verse 26, so that your proud confidence in me may abound in Christ Jesus through my coming to you again. He says, Paul's hope and desires he'd be freed from prison and he'd have a chance to go and visit the Philippians again. Only conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or remain absent, I will hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel. Now, this was Paul's attitude. He wanted to be free because he thought he could still do good for the Philippians. But then he tells the Philippians, if I don't get a chance to visit you, what do I expect? Whether I come to visit or whether you never see my face again, you stand by the truth. You stand by Christ. You do what is right. And that should be the same attitude we take. As we live our life as Christians, there are going to be people in your life that build you up and make you stronger, and you think, I'm a better Christian for them. And then, when they move out of your life, what should you do? Whether those people are there or not, you stand by Christ. You do what's right. And that's the way we need to be. We need to be people who have decided for ourselves to plant our feet. We talk about this with kids who are raised in the church, and we say at some point we want them to make it their own, so that whether mommy and daddy are there to hold their hand or whether or not they are doing it all by themselves, they will at some point say, this is my belief, not my parents, not my family's, this is my trust in Christ. And he says that you would stand firm that way in one spirit. Verse 28, in no way alarmed by your opponents, which is a sign of destruction for them, but of salvation for you, and that too from God. So here's Paul, and he points out this kind of strange idea. When your opponents, and he talks in other places that they were afflicted there in Philippi, they suffered for the gospel. I want you to imagine for a second, if all of a sudden somebody came in here and said, Scott Beyer, you're under arrest for embezzlement. Or, Scott Beyer, you're under arrest for cheating on your taxes. And so they came in that door and they pulled out the cuffs. If I said, no, I didn't do it, and ran, what would you think? You think I did it. That's what people do when they did it. They say, no, I didn't, and then they run. But if I stood there and I said, officers, I don't know what's happened. Would I be comfortable, by the way? Would I enjoy that? No. But if I said, officers, I don't know what's happened, but take me in, I know the truth will exonerate me. What would that do to my opponents? Just that behavior. It would tell people, this guy's an innocent man. Now, that's what Paul is saying. When they persecute you for Christ, when they try and throw you in prison, when they try and mistreat you, you just act godly. You don't let them see you sweat. You don't run out of fear. You don't be a fearful person. Remember what Paul told Timothy? God gave us a spirit of power and love and discipline, not of timidity. Revelation 21 says that fearful people, 21:8, says that the lake of fire, and it lists all the different people go to the lake of fire, and one of them is the fearful person, the cowardly person. Isn't that terrifying? Isn't that terrifying that fearful people will go to hell? If we can't just learn to plant our feet and have some faith, we're going to be in trouble. And so Paul says, when your opponents attack you, when they say malicious things about you, don't you let them see you sweat. You stand firm and you'll be fine. And he says, verse 29-30, for to you it has been granted for Christ's sake, not only to believe in Him, but also to suffer for His sake, experiencing the same conflict which you saw in me and now here to be in me. So Paul says, I'm not the only Christian to suffer, and you're going to too, but it is something that has been granted for Christ's sake that you could suffer. Remember when the apostles were beaten in the book of Acts, and they went out, they were beaten by the Sanhedrin, and they went out rejoicing that they were considered worthy to suffer for Christ's name's sake. That's what Paul's saying. Only the strong does God use to give an example of faithfulness like that. God won't ever allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able. So if you are put through a trial for Christ's name's sake, what does that tell you? God thinks you're able. He thinks you can handle it. He thinks you've got what it takes. And so Paul says, rejoice, because you've been considered worthy. It's been granted to you to suffer for Christ's name's sake. And so we finished chapter 1 there. Chapter 2, we'll get into look at humility, unity in the church, and the joy that comes with that. Anybody have any comments or questions before we close down? Okay, we'll close down there, and we'll pick up in chapter 2 next week.